nothing supernatural. And then a social scientist who has written... Have you ever read Middlemarch? Anyone here read Middlemarch? Do you remember Mr. Casaubon, who's writing The Key to All Mythologies? It was Mr. Casaubon writing The Key to All Mythologies. So he'd written a book on it and showing that everything in the Bible they'd got from anything wasn't original, and all mythology was bad, and thank God we're free of all that now, the sort of secular humanism, atheism. Very positivist. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you, Dorothy, for joining us for this second in a series on women in this and that. Last week we heard about the women who were in Jesus' entourage from Galilee to Jerusalem and other connections. And today we're going to hear about women and the resurrection stories. I don't think that's the right way to say it, but you will correct me.
That's absolutely fine. Thank you, Jeff. Thanks, everyone. And I want to begin with an apology, as a good Christian should. And that is that I had tried to do a handout for last week, and somehow I got completely muddled. I know, it's not like me. And so what I've done now in penitence and faith, I have given you the readings from last week and this week. So, Susan, you're not going to miss anything. I knew it would you'd turn up and say that, etc. So we saw last week that that women are present and in places that we might not expect them to be, and that we have a tendency to write them out. Whereas I take the policy that they're included unless we're told otherwise. So. And I think that's right. So we found that women were present on the journey to Jerusalem. It wasn't just the 12 disciples, the 12 apostles. There were also women disciples. The women were actually disciples and were engaged in ministry throughout Jesus' ministry. And then at the Passion, they were present. They were at a distance in the Synoptic Gospels, near the cross or at the foot of the cross in John's Gospel. And these women are faithful when the 12 have denied, betrayed, or simply fled. We find the presence of these women. And also some unexpected men too, like in the Synoptic Gospels, the Roman centurion, or like Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus in the burial. So unexpected people are present with Jesus, not the ones we might have expected. And that continues then into the resurrection narratives. That theme continues. And so we see that we've seen that women are witnesses to the death of Jesus and to the burial, in a context in which women couldn't formally be witnesses. It was unusual to have a woman as a witness in a court of law. But here they play the role of witnesses. And to the death of Jesus and the burial, and also, as we'll see, to the empty tomb. Now, I've distinguished here between, last week it was between, I had Mark and Matthew together, chummy, but this time we'll see them a little bit separate. Luke a little bit different, John quite different. So I'm going to go through those, and I'm going to start with Mark 16, 1-8. Which is the fourth passage down. I numbered the passages. So Mark 16, 1-8 tells the familiar story about the women arriving at the tomb, the women disciples. I try not to refer to them as the women, but the women disciples. Sometimes I forget. The women disciples, 3 of them, arrive at the tomb. And there's 3 women who are named. Mary Magdalene, we already saw that last week, and we saw that her surname is most likely a nickname, meaning Mary the Tower, something like that. So Mary the Tower, Mary the mother of James, whoever he was, and Salome, not the dancer of with the 7 veils. who's probably a child anyway. So they go to anoint the body, and that's early on Sunday morning. And they're worried about the stone, and of course they find that it's already been removed from the stone, and there's an angel there and gives them the message of the resurrection. So they're now witnesses to the death, the burial, and the empty tomb. And then they're given the commission to go and tell his disciples, the other disciples. So they went, but then we've got a strange ending. So they went and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Now that is actually where the Gospel of Mark ends. That's where it ends. Yeah. I've actually seen one of the early manuscripts, because when I was at the British Library, it so happened they had it open at Mark 16, which was quite a thrill. I was getting very excited. That just sort of calmed me down a bit. But the earliest, we've got two beautiful codices of the Bible, and the whole Bible, and they are from the 4th, 5th century, and neither of them have anything but this. But some later manuscripts have got two added endings. There's one little short one, and there's another one that's a kind of clearly a summary of all the resurrection stories in the Gospels, and it mentions Mary Magdalene. So we think that these were added quite early, but they're not. They don't go back to the 1st century. So Mark's Gospel ends on this very ambiguous note. Now, scholars are divided as to how we interpret the ending. Some of them say there's a lost ending, that we've lost it and we don't have it. And Bishop Brad Billings has got a theory. I forget his theory, but it's an interesting one. But most scholars think that what happens is that we have the male disciples failing and the women disciples lasting a bit longer, but also failing in the end. So that in the end, what we're left with is the failure of all disciples. That's the view of Frank Maloney and quite a number of very respectable New Testament scholars. It's perhaps even a majority, actually. The other view is a somewhat minority view, but is the view that in fact, what their fear, they said nothing to anyone on the way home. Obviously they spoke, otherwise no one would know. And what their fear is a holy fear, awe, if you like. So and there are places in Mark's Gospel where fear is, shall we say, positive? Yeah, positive thing. It's the sort of awe that you have in the presence of God, when you're faced with the majesty, if not the mercy of God. It's a kind of fear, and so they just want to get the hell out of there. This is overwhelming for them. It's literally an ineffable event, and ineffable means you can't speak about it. You can't find the words, and we all know experiences in our own lives that are ineffable. It's both positive and negative experiences. And so ineffable, they said nothing, they couldn't speak. At least for a while, they were actually struck dumb. So unexpected is the message. So I'm going to leave it there, but with those alternative meanings. Either of them, both, I think, interpretations make sense of Mark's Gospel. I personally think the second one, it makes more sense of Mark's Gospel, but that would be disputed. However, thank God for Matthew. He comes along and takes a look at Mark and goes, I think we're going to have to clear this up because people are wondering. And so we get the story fairly similar story. And then when you look at the end, you'll see that verse 8, this is the 5th passage. Verse 8, so they left the tomb quickly with fear and great joy. Matthew adds those words, and great joy, to clarify any possible misunderstanding, that it is holy fear. However, it's worth looking a little bit more closely at Matthew's story and its differences. First of all, we've got the presence of the guard at the tomb, and we won't worry about those. So you get the message you get the empty tomb, the message of the resurrection. He's been raised, come and see the place, and they're given the commission. So they left the tomb, and then verse 9. Suddenly, Jesus met them and said, "Greetings." This is completely gratuitous. They do not need to meet the risen Christ, and yet they do. He appears to them even though they already believe. They're already running off to tell. They're already full of joy, and yet he appears before them. So it's an act of pure grace. It's a gift that they're given, that they don't need, but they're given it. And they came to him, took hold of his feet and worshipped him. And so there's not a moment of doubt in their minds. And Jesus says, confirms the message not to be afraid and confirms the commission they're given. Now, we're usually more familiar with Matthew 28 with the Great Commission, aren't we? The 11 on the mountain. But interestingly, it's where Jesus appears to the 11 apostles on the mountain. Only 11, because of course Judas is already dead in Matthew's account. So they appear, and it says, the text says, they worshipped, but they doubted. Or it could mean, but some doubted. You could translate it either way. Either some doubted or but they doubted. And I think it's interesting. I know it's not a competition, but I just want to say that there's no doubt whatsoever in the 2 women disciples, but there is doubt in the 11. And then, of course, you get the Great Commission that's given to the 11 apostles. I think the point is about Matthew is that you have a double resurrection appearance and a double commissioning. And I think we neglect the first one. I think we downplay it because we're, galloping along to try and get to that mountain Galilee because we love the Great Commission, don't we? Well, let's just look at the other one too. And let's not jump over too quickly, because I think that's what we tend to do. And that is that the risen Lord appears to these two women disciples. They come to full faith and they're given their own commission, which is to report back to the rest of the believing community, which they faithfully do. So you've got something very interesting going on with Mark and Matthew there. We need to jump now to Luke chapter 24, 1 to 11. Luke is also following Mark, but doing somewhat his own thing, a little bit more than Matthew does. And disappointingly, we don't seem to have a story of Jesus appearing to a woman, but I will qualify that in a moment. But we get the story. They go to the tomb, they take the spices, they find it. This time it's 2 angels, not 1. And you get, why do you seek for the living among the dead? And the angel says to them, this is passage number 8, verse 6, remember how he told you when he was in Galilee. Then verse 8, then they remembered. So you've got that dynamic remembering, which is, of course, so important in our Eucharist, isn't it? Remembering, how important. Remembering is not just, oh yeah, I remember you said that. It's not that. It's more bringing to mind the significance of what they've been told. They remembered. And of course, their remembering is a remembering of faith. And they run back to tell all the rest. And then Luke names them again for us. Now, he hasn't named them at the Passion narrative because he's already named them back in chapter 8, verses 1 to 3. But now there's a naming. Mary Magdalene, Joanna, whom we've already met, Mary, the mother of James, this other Mary, and the other women. These are the Galilean women. But what happens? These words seem to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them. So Luke emphasises the lack of faith on the part of the apostles, which contrasts with the faith of the women disciples. Now, and then Luke makes mention of an appearance to Peter. But then we have the story of the 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus. Remember that story? It's quite a long story. It's Jesus appearing to them on the road, and then the climax is, of course, the supper at Emmaus, which is with all its Eucharistic overtones. Breaking the bread, did not our hearts burn within us? Now, these 2 disciples are going the wrong way. For Luke, everything is Jerusalem. Everything devolves on Jerusalem, and in Acts, his 2nd volume, everything fans out from there, from Jerusalem. Whereas Mark and Matthew have got a thing about Galilee, but Luke couldn't really care 2 hoots about Galilee. He's not interested in any of the Galilean stories, only the Jerusalem ones. So Jerusalem is the centre, and here are these 2 disciples going off in the wrong direction, to Emmaus. Wrong way. Jesus appears and brings them back, and they return to Jerusalem. And it's been suggested, one of them is named Cleopas, a male disciple outside of the 12. It's been suggested that that other woman is his wife, probably Mary, and that's a possibility. And some people have argued Luke simply doesn't tell us who this other disciple is. I've kind of switched my views on that one, because of course Luke is telling the story, and if it is a woman, he's not chosen to emphasise it, but it could be that second person is Cleopas's wife, who I think is another Mary, like so many. So, but then you get Jesus appearing to the whole gathered community in Jerusalem, in the upper room, where he confirms the message of the resurrection. He speaks about the Old Testament, the prophets, and he promises, he says, wait here until the promise from on high comes, the promise of the Holy Spirit. So Luke is already looking forward to volume 2. And then at the end of that, it says that, sorry, let me just get it correctly instead of just from memory. At the end of that, Luke says, then he led them, that's Jesus, led them out as far as Bethany, and lifting up his hands, he blessed them. While he was blessing them, he withdrew from them and was carried up into heaven. And they worshipped him and returned to Jerusalem with great joy, and they were continually in the temple blessing God. Now we think again that's an event at which only the 12 were present, or the 11, that they get reconstituted, so don't panic. And we end up with 12 again. And we assume that that's just the 12, but it's not. It's not. It's that larger group. Remember, 70 of them have been sent out on mission. It's a big crowd. And they include women disciples, so it's not just the apostles. It's also the whole crowd. And when we get to Acts chapter 1, verse 14, all these, and he's talking about the 11, all these were constantly devoting themselves to prayer, waiting for the promise from on high, together with certain women, including Mary, the mother of Jesus, as well as his brothers, probably brothers and sisters. So we get the sense that these Galilean women have followed all the way, and that they're also there at Pentecost. I said that last week, so I don't need to labour that point. So Luke may seem to give less stress to women, but I think ultimately he doesn't. We assume that they're there, that they're present. And so you've got to watch out for the iconography, because the iconography is almost always just the men. But some of the Orthodox icons have Mary there. Have you seen any of them of Pentecost? They present Mary there, and I think that's probably an older form, and certainly more faithful to Luke's story. That it's not just the 12 who are present at Pentecost, it's also the holy women, the women from Galilee, including Mary Magdalene. These all speak in tongues and have the tongues of fire on their head and so on. So Luke again is different, and he has his own way of emphasising. None of the disciples are feminists. You know, we're not talking about feminism. This is anachronistic, but we are talking about an emphasis on women that I think has been downplayed in the way that we've read these texts. Finally, John's Gospel, and that's the last of those readings in chapter 20 of John's Gospel, the 10th passage. So we have this very strange story, and the old lectionary, the common lectionary that the Roman Catholic Church still uses, just finishes without telling the whole story of Mary Magdalene. It's absolutely outrageous that they do that, but they do. But this is really important. It's one of those kind of sandwich stories. So you've got the story of Mary Magdalene, and then you've got the other 2 disciples, then you go back to Mary Magdalene. And it's one story, it belongs together. So you have only Mary Magdalene. Now, unlike the other Gospels, you don't have 2 women as in Matthew, 3 women as in Mark, 3 women plus as in Luke, but you've only got one, although she does say in verse 2, they have taken the Lord out of the tomb and we do not know where they have laid him. So John chooses just to focus on Mary, Mary Magdalene. And he does so because he does like that personal encounter between Jesus and one other person. That's exactly what happens. So she finds the stone already gone, and she assumes that someone has stolen the body. She jumps to the conclusion that the tomb has been rifled and the body has been stolen. And then two other disciples, and the second one is not named. So let's resist the impulse to name him. Peter and the other disciple, they set out. And then they have this race, which is all a bit strange. But anyway, then the other disciple actually comes to some sort of faith. When he sees the headcloth, the other disciple who reached the tomb first also went in, and he saw and he believed. Well, you think that's the first one to believe. But John goes on, for as yet they did not understand the scripture that he must rise from the dead. Now, we've got a problem here, and so scholars approach it in different ways. Some of them say, he believed in the resurrection, but he didn't know that it was in the Bible as well. That's Frank Maloney's view. And he's not alone in that view. And other people say, well, it's just because John's just got muddled. He's, sort of playing around with stories and trying to meld them together, and he's not quite succeeded in doing it. But scholars, by and large, want to claim this other disciple, the beloved disciple, as the first. And that doesn't make sense to me and to a number of others of us. We think that what's going on is the beloved disciple has an inkling, but not enough to say anything, because he doesn't say a word. And so he does kind of understand. He thinks, this might be, or maybe not, but he hasn't really understood. And so, and more to the point, he goes back home. He doesn't hang around. He doesn't say anything to Mary. And at this point we find Mary weeping. Now, when she looks inside, verse 11, she looks into the tomb, and this time, she hasn't seen this before, but there's a lot of strange elements to this story. This time she sees two angels in white, two angels, but they're inside the tomb and they're sitting at either end of the stone slab on which the body of Jesus lay. Rowan Williams has pointed out that, and I think he gets this from reading some of the early fathers and mothers of the church, that it's a reminder of the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant has the two cherubim on either side, and I think that is one of the reasons that we have candles on either side of the altar, to represent those two angels. And the Ark of the Covenant, you'll recall, was a box, basically a box covered in gold, beautiful box, with two angels on either side with their wings touching, and an empty space where the seat is. There is actually no depiction of God. So it's an empty space, and that's exactly what you have here. You have an empty space, and yet it's a redolent emptiness, is it not? It's an emptiness that it's a kind of presence in absence that I think that John is portraying here. Now, what function do the angels have? Very little. Their function is their posture. They don't have very much to say. They don't give the message of the resurrection. It's simply their posture, and they say, "Why are you weeping?" Why on earth would you be weeping, is the question. Now, Mary at this point and she repeats, they've taken my Lord from the tomb. She still has a misunderstanding here. She thinks that the body has been stolen. And she turns around, she sees Jesus, she fails to recognise him. Now, that's quite common in the resurrection narratives. The two disciples on the road to Emmaus, they don't recognise Jesus. So there's a common motif of lack of recognition. There's something different about Jesus. There's something fundamentally different, and yet there's also something the same. So that's a sort of common motif. But then we have to remember she's weeping, and you can't see very well when you're crying. She thinks it's the gardener, and she says to him, "Sir," not Lord, The Greek can mean either, but it's sir. If you carried away, tell me where I've laid him, I'll take him away. And he just says to her one word, Mariam, Mary. He only says her name, and that's enough. And that's enough for her to recognise him. In the road to Emmaus, in Luke 24, it's the breaking of the bread that enables them. Oh, the aha moment. But the aha moment for Mary is simply her name. And of course that recalls, does it not, the Good Shepherd in John, who knows his own sheep, knows them by name, and they of course know him. So here she shows herself to be one of the sheep of the Good Shepherd. She says to him, Rabboni, which is Aramaic, but Jeff can can correct me on that, which means my teacher. And Jesus says, do not touch me. Now that do not touch me is probably, and the old version of the NRSV translated it, do not hold onto me, and I think that's better, because the Greek, without going into details, has got this sense of ongoing touching. It's not don't touch me, it's don't hold on to me. So we assume that Mary is already embracing him in some way. I like to think she's giving him a hug, but of course, more realistically, she's at his feet, touching his feet. That's much more likely in the ancient world. I'm being very modern here. She's already touching. It's do not go on touching me is the sense. Why? Because this is not the way I'm going to be with you. I have not yet ascended to the Father, but go to my brothers. That should be brothers and sisters, so do feel free to write that in your Bibles. I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. Mary Magdalene went and announced, I have seen the Lord. She's given the commission and she carries it out faithfully. So here we find a sort of growing in faith of Mary. From her misunderstanding to a further misunderstanding, she thinks Jesus' presence is the way he will be with her, but it isn't. How will he be with her? The next scene will tell us, through the Spirit, through the gift of the Spirit. And finally, of course, at his future coming. And so her misunderstandings are she moves beyond them to a full faith, and she carries out the commission, I have seen the Lord. And on the basis of this, the early church referred to her as the Apostle of the Apostles, the Apostle of the Apostles, and a title that she still holds. That bell reminds us of the Incarnation, incidentally. Now, there's a couple of things that I think we should say about this, that the church has always honoured Mary, as we do in this parish, but one of the problems is, and I think I said this last week and I want to emphasise it again, is that when you separate Mary, you make her an ever-virgin, which nothing in the Bible says she is, incidentally, nothing to suppose that she didn't have lots of children with Joseph. So if you make her an ever-virgin and you separate her, we end up with problems. We end up with problems because, as one Catholic theologian, Elizabeth Johnson, has said, she ends up taking over the role of the Holy Spirit, which I think she did in the Western tradition, which was never strong on the Spirit, unlike the Eastern tradition, which was. So you do that, but then you also ignore the other women. And Mary, the mother of Jesus, has been referred to as a new Eve, and there's a lot of music that talks about her as a new Eve. But so is Mary Magdalene. She too is named woman. She too is given the title of woman. And one of the early fathers, Hippolytus, talks about both Marys as apostles of the apostles and new Eves. So it's not just Mary, the mother of Jesus. It's also Mary, the apostle of the apostles. Mary, the Theotokos, the God-bearer, as the early church called her, quite rightly, God-bearer, Theotokos. Mother of God, we translate it rather loosely into English, not a very good translation, I think, of the Greek, which is God-bearer. So we've got Mary, the God-bearer, and Mary, the apostle of the apostles. And in those two women, with them, we have all the other Galilean women as well, disciples. So it seems to me that women play a very prominent role in the New Testament in terms of the resurrection. They are the witnesses, not only of the death, the burial, the empty tomb, but also of the Lord's risen presence with them. And we have that quite clearly from both Matthew's Gospel and John's Gospel. The presence of the women, their faith and their faithfulness in carrying out the commission that they're given. So that's probably about all I wanted to say. How many comments or questions or radical disagreements? Feel free to disagree radically or otherwise.
Depending on how radical you want to be, I'll just take this. I'm going to knock a tooth out of you, Dorothy. There you are.
Thank you.
So you can use this, and Dorothy can use it to answer as well.
I'll rather just make a comment, which you referred to, that I think that this we need now to inspire a whole lot of composers to rewrite a lot of music about, and this comes up both in our hymnody and in trying to choose things that actually have a balance in our liturgy.
Just agreeing entirely with you. Our liturgies need to reflect that. See you, Bob. And also our hymnody, our anthems, our lectionary. Well, the Revised Common Lectionary does reflect that, has made an effort to reflect it. So we need to actually find ways in our liturgies to reflect, I think, new insights, the insights that our generation brings to the great insights that we've received from the past. And I'm not trying to downplay the role of Mary, the mother of Jesus here, the mother of God, the God-bearer. I mean, it's a huge role. It's immensely important. But I would say that Mary Magdalene's role is equally important, because we have the incarnation, but it's meaningless without the resurrection. And I think it's lovely that both those women are present at the cross in John. They're together. So we need to hold them together and allow all the other Galilean women too to have a place at the table.
Can I ask one for a moment? A couple of times you talked about almost a tension between the women and the apostles, or the apostles are misunderstanding. It's the women who bring the understanding. And that seems to be quite explicit in the text, but I'm not sure that it's very explicit in our tradition. Yeah. How do we find a way to rediscover that without having to denigrate the apostles in the process? Or maybe that's the solution.
No, I don't want to denigrate the apostles. I'm not quite sure how we do it. I think you're right. I think Mark's gospel, for example, the apostles are supposed to be there. They're supposed to be there, but they're not. So they've somehow failed. And that failure is embodied by Peter. But of course, Peter is restored, particularly in John's gospel. He's restored to fidelity as a disciple. So no, we don't want to downplay the 12. We just don't want them by themselves. We want to see that the women disciples also contribute something valuable, and that sometimes they do a better job. They're not the only ones. There are also some men who do a better job as well. But John doesn't give a great deal of emphasis on the failure of the disciples. Mark does. I think Luke is a bit kinder to them. Mark's a bit hard on them, I think. But certainly there is a contrast, although there's also a rehabilitation of them. They are, even in Mark, go and tell Peter. So there's a rehabilitation there. How we reflect this, I'm not sure. I mean, if we're following Frank Maloney and Morna Hooker and several other scholars on the ending of Mark, then we'll say that the women also fail, that women and men all fail Jesus. And it's a kind of call to repentance, therefore. So we need to just be aware of that as well, that, you know, there are different ways of reading the ending of Mark's Gospel. I don't know how we do it. Musically, I think, is one way. Liturgically, we do it. I mean, we need to use the Revised Common Lectionary because it not only this story but various other stories of women, it makes them more prominent, whereas the common lectionary keeps women, I think, rather hidden. But I will say this, the Catholic Church has recognised Mary as the apostle of the apostles, Mary Magdalene. And I think it's interesting that we often translate Peter's feast day to a Sunday, but there's not many places that translate Mary Magdalene's to a feast day. It's in June, isn't it? I forget the date. But, we should consider actually including her as a major feast day in the church, I think. There's ways we can do this. But, you sometimes, I was listening not so long ago to the Roman Catholic in their new lectionary, to the new missal, to the first Eucharistic prayer. It's just a whole list of males. It's just so offensive, I nearly walked out. And we had all the 12, and then we had Peter and we had Linus, and oh my God, it went on and on. And it's just so insulting to the women who are present, and to the fact that so many women were preachers, were evangelists, were deacons, were priests, even bishops, certainly were martyrs. And the church is quite happy to admit women as martyrs. I find that interesting.
Thanks, Dorothy. And I'm really sorry I missed last week. I just wanted to clarify something you were talking about in relation to Luke. And I think you said it, as I heard it, you were sort of saying it's not quite clear, but you think he's suggesting that the women were there, or particular women were there. And is that just in relation to the resurrection, you mean? Because I'd always understood Luke as to being very conscious about the presence of women and actually drawing our attention to them, unlike some of the others. So I guess I'm asking perhaps that, given that inclination that he has generally, is it sort of unusual that we have to be careful to read into it that they're there? Am I making myself clear? That we have to sort of work to read into their presence at the resurrection, as I hear you doing, given his otherwise tendency to see them. Yeah.
There's certainly a very strong view, and an early view of Luke is that Luke adds more women and is more pro-women than men. That view, and so all the way through Luke you get this pairing of women and men. And I think you do with the holy women and the apostles. You get this sort of pairing that goes on. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, there are some scholars who've questioned that and who actually take the view that Luke adds more women to silence them. That's the view of Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza, who's a very eminent scholar, and a number of other women. I think these days now, I think there was an Alleluia chorus about Luke for a bit, and then there was this negative, and now I think you get different views. I think Luke does his best with women. He's in a patriarchal world. I think that those who say he only introduces women to silence them, it's a conspiracy theory, and I hate conspiracy theories, and I don't want to listen to them on Instagram or when I'm reading, New Testament scholars either. It just makes Luke out to be quite malevolent character. I don't think he does that. It's true that there are not as many women in Acts as there are in Luke. It is true. I think there's something extraordinary about Jesus himself that Luke is reflecting in his attitude to women. But I think Luke was aware. But when you get to Acts, Luke's got a different agenda. He's not trying to include women or exclude them. He's on about the Gentiles. That's his passion in Acts. The gospel reaching the ends of the earth and of course going to the Gentiles. And of course women are included among Gentiles, so I'm not too worried about that. So he's got his own emphasis, but But I think, yeah, maybe you're right, but I just think so many depictions, so many of our art and our iconography portrays just the 12. I can think of icons now or paintings by Duccio, by some of the medieval Renaissance painters. You know, it's Jesus and a group of men. Although there is one lovely icon you may have seen where there's a group of men and they're in a little sort of cubicle, and Mary Magdalene standing outside with her finger raised, lecturing them. There's also a cartoon that has the apostles and the holy women, and Peter is saying, it's Easter Monday, it's saying, right ladies, you've done a great job, we'll take over from here, you know. It's resisting the impulse. You know, when you enter imaginatively into the scriptures, what do you see? What do you see in that scene? You know, and I think a lot of us see a group of 12 men instead of seeing 11 men and a whole lot of other people too, including some other men who are not apostles. So I just want us to bring them back. And not only bring them back, but actually see their presence as kind of trajectories that we can push into, you know, that we can take further. I mean, they were not able to live out the sort of equality of men and women that we are trying to do, although I sometimes think in some places it's going backwards and may need to be reasserted. I think that's true in parts of our church and also in certain countries in the world. So I think we need to take what's there and push it further, just as we do on issues of slavery or other issues. The New Testament does what it can, but it can't live out the full implications. That's our task, to live out more and more fully than perhaps previous generations did the gospel, and future generations will hopefully see some of the mistakes that we made and live it out more fully in another way.
Thank you so much. This is fascinating. Two questions, they're quite different. One is, can you just talk a little more about the Galilean women? Like, why is it important, that their place is important, particularly in the context of the Jerusalem-centric orientation that you've described of Luke? That's one question about how does place matter in their identity? And then, while fully on board with the project to restore women to their rightful place in these stories, when we talk about, you know, faithful first, obedient first, there first, present first, witnessing first, how do we avoid the risk of, you know, women are more pious, are more devout, are more less forgivable, less able to fail? I'm just interested in how you avoid that kind of conundrum.
Yeah. Thanks. Good questions. I'll start with the second one, and that is, I remember Margaret Thatcher. That's how I avoid that. And I remember that, and one of my friends who was campaigned for the ordination of women said, in the end of the day, women have got as much right to muck up the church as men. And in a way, I think I don't want to be on a pedestal. I know I'll fall off it very quickly. So putting women down and putting them on a pedestal are both ways of distancing women and not actually being inclusive. So you're absolutely right. We do have to be careful to avoid women are superior to men, even though many women actually do think that. Sorry, but they do. At least women I talk to, and give them a few glasses of red, and they'll go on about. But yeah, we're all fallen. I mean, there's one feminist scholar who wrote a book called, I've forgotten the name of it. I shouldn't have even suggested I knew the name of it. She says one of the ways we're equal is our sinfulness and our need of grace. We're absolutely equal to men. And I thought that was a very profound thing to say, because she was talking about the women of Grenham Common and how, there was this whole thing going about how superior. Now, that was until how superior women were. That was until women from other cultures and other contexts and other nations, ethnic women, started to say, hang on, this is all about white women. This is all about white middle-class women, and women had to go, oh, oops, maybe we're not so perfect. So I think it's something we always have to watch out for. And it's a kind of, the same woman, Angela West, who wrote the book, whose name I can't remember, she also says that patriarchy declared Eve guilty. Eve was blamed for sin. She said at some point, feminism in the 60s declared Eve innocent. And she said, that neither has helped us. So equal, but and so it's really good to say that women did some things well, but we've got, Luke tells the story of Ananias and Sapphira. She's into it up to her neck in that deception that goes on. And we've got figures like Herodias. We do have, the Old Testament gives us figures like Jezebel, quite nice, evil little characters there that remind us. But it's just because we've been, I think, so put down that Eve is guilty that we sometimes maybe err on the other side, but it doesn't really help us in the end. So how do we get a balance? I think that's really important. With the Galilean women, it's because Jesus' ministry, Jesus' ministry initially is in Galilee. He's from Galilee. His first disciples are all Galilean. They're all Galilean Jews. And almost all of them are Jews, and they're all Galilean. So that's the impetus of Jesus' ministry, and all the Gospels, I think, reflect that. But in Luke's Gospel, there's one long journey that Luke hones in on Jerusalem. So we start the Gospel in Jerusalem in the temple with Zechariah. Jesus goes to the temple as a baby and then as a 12-year-old. And then a lot of Luke's Gospel, about 10 chapters, is the long journey to Jerusalem. So the whole thing devolves down into Jerusalem and then spans out. And those first disciples, that core group, are all Galilean, including the apostles. They're all Galilean. I'm not saying there weren't other disciples. There were. Martha and Mary of Bethany, for example, are not Galilean. At least they're not in John's Gospel. So the Galilean women, Luke mentions them in chapter 8. So we did this partly last week. Suddenly in Mark's Gospel, he tells us, there were women at a distance who'd followed him. These are Galilean women who followed him all the way to Jerusalem. So it's not just Jesus and the 12. It's been Jesus and the Galilean women as well as the 12. And, as I say, some other men. So you get this sense from... And Luke, unlike Mark, actually mentions them early on. Before Jesus even starts the journey, he tells us that there are these women of some means who bankrolled the whole thing. And, otherwise, why do you think Jesus can wander around? What's he eating? Where's he staying? Who's providing accommodation for him? Who's putting up the tents? Who's buying the food? Well, we know now. Luke tells us it's these women. Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Susanna, one of whom is probably higher class than the rest of them. And they bankrolled, but I like to think that their ministry consisted of other things too that they might have done. And Mary Magdalene, the tower, who's a tower among those women, who's the kind of main one. So you get a kind of sense in the Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels, the first three, that there's not just the 12, but there's three close men, Peter, James and John. They're the first disciples. And for some reason, poor old Andrew gets left out. John brings him back, though, because John likes him. But you get the three inner disciples, and you get three women inner disciples as well. So Jesus has also three women, among others. So there's that sort of inner three with the men and inner three with the women. And the point about them being Galilean women is that so were the apostles Galilean men. That's where the core of Jesus' ministry came from, and the early church. I think John's Gospel, incidentally, is, I think the author of John's Gospel, whatever we mean by author, which is not clear in the ancient world, is actually outside of the 12 and from Judea. So there are some significant disciples from Judea as well.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. No.
I thought you were going to object, Peter, to what I said about the Mother of God.
No, absolutely not. but it's caused me to reflect a lot on my background, not just my Catholic background, but my religious order background. And, you know, I think, for example, about the enormous emphasis we used to put in the school scene on May altars. And it was as if nothing else mattered except somehow honouring Mary. And other things just didn't register. And the other brief reflection that hit me today was that one of the very interesting traditions that the Christian Brothers have and still have is that when they're burying one of their own, the last thing they do at the graveside is sing the Salve Regina.
I personally have problems with the Salve Regina because I don't like referring to Mary as our advocate. I think we're in real trouble when we're giving her titles like that, or co-redemptrix, or any of the other titles. And look, my views are based on Roman Catholic women like Elizabeth Johnson, you know, who is saying this point about we need to make sure that we don't put Mary on the divine side, so that she becomes the comforter. The Holy Spirit is the comforter. And so we need to sort of realign our theology. And I think we also have to realign it in relation to women. Let's not leave her by herself. She's surrounded by the Galilean women. Let's keep her that way. And let's keep her alongside Mary Magdalene and not isolate her. So I still want to honour her, but I also want to honour Mary Magdalene and Mary and Martha of Bethany and Susanna and Joanna and a whole crowd of them. But I also want to honour the 12.
So
throughout my school days, which were with the Salesian nuns, which is a fairly progressive order compared to others, whenever I served, it wasn't at the altar. I was the altar girl, but always on the outside, where we kneel for communion, never inside there. And I did that throughout my senior primary and all of my high school days. So we were always kept separate, in a sense, or not quite in.
Yeah, that's right. Keeping women out of the sanctuary, except for when it comes to cleaning it. When we're not worried about whether they're menstruating or not, are we? Because that's and doing the flowers, because that's what it does worry some of the Orthodox.
We're going to finish in a minute because we have to be out of the church by 12:30. And we have to save time to thank Dorothy. I wanted to ask a question which I'm going to forego for another occasion, on the prominence of named women in Acts, many of whom were Gentiles. So we can.
First European Christian is a woman.
Yeah, so we can come back to that. If it wasn't Maria, the mother of John Mark. Yep. And her servant girl, named, by the way, in the text, yeah, and plays a very prominent role. She's not silenced in that text. So, anyway, but that's the weeds. I don't want us to finish in the weeds. I want us to finish with a big picture. What happened today was that a prominent New Testament scholar who has spent her career reading everything there was to read, but not just reading it and distilling it and brokering it, but thinking about it and coming up with her own conclusions about it, has shared that broadest insight with us. And we're so grateful to you, Dorothy, but we want our takeaway to be thinking more about how we can get this to happen. Because we've reflected today on how many times our tradition has let us down, Eastern and Western. And we need to find a way for the church to benefit more widely from that sort of insight and that sort of theological overview. Profoundly important for us.
Can I just say, too, is this still on?
Yeah.
Right. You know, today we had someone presiding at Holy Eucharist today, Mother Catherine Bellhouse, a younger woman. It's wonderful to see younger women coming through, whose priesthood is not recognised in the Anglican Church in Sydney. So she comes down here so she can celebrate Holy Eucharist with us, because she can't in Sydney. She's recognised as a deacon and that's it. So I just think that's both wonderful that there are very talented, and she's a very fine theologian, actually, Catherine. It's wonderful that she's there and she's in ministry and there are young women like that, but it's also tragic. I know you want to end on a high note, so...
No, I don't. I wanted to end on a low note.
Oh, right. Okay, well, the low note is that Sydney will not recognise her as a priest. And so the parish she worships in, Christchurch St Lawrence, does recognise her, of course, but can't formally recognise her as a priest.
So, have a think about how we can use Delta as a way of opening up these questions for the benefit of the wider church. It's not an Anglo-Catholic idea. It's an idea that relates to profound theological reflection and how we let it change our lives. So let's ponder that, find a way to do it. Thank you, Dorothy, again.
Now we have to vacate the premises.
The